I'm 74 years old today. Saying it out loud still sounds strange, as if the number doesn't belong to me completely. For a long time, I avoided numbers, dates, time marks. They always seemed like silent accusations, remembering everything that happened without me having the courage to interrupt. But now I say without looking away, I'm 74 years old. And this story begins exactly here, at the point where silence can no longer sustain itself. For almost my entire life, I believed what I was told. I believed it because it seemed easier, safer, less painful than doubting. They said it was just like that certain things are not questioned, that good people don't create conflicts. I heard, accepted, and repeated this inside me so many times that at some point, it started to sound like absolute truth. They said that resisting was selfish, that disagreeing hurt, that complaining was something for ungrateful people. And I believed every word, not because they were fair, but because they came loaded with authority, conditioned affection, and a silent promise of belonging. If I kept quiet, everything would be fine. Or at least that's what I thought. Today, sitting alone in the living room of the house where I have lived for decades, I realize how much this belief has shaped every detail of my existence. The walls around me bear the marks of time, but none of them scream. Everything here is discreet, restrained, polite, as I always have been, as I learned to be. A whole life organized so as not to bother anyone. There are days when silence weighs more than it should. It's not just the absence of voices. It's the presence of everything that has never been said. Swallowed words, postponed wills, decisions made by others in my name. Silence is not empty. It is full, too crowded. And now, in old age, it echoes. I spent many years believing that this was virtue, that enduring silence made me better, stronger, more worthy of respect. I confused resistance with stubbornness and submission with kindness, and no one ever corrected me. On the contrary, I was praised countless times for being easygoing. This praise accompanied me like a seal of social approval. But there is a cost in being too easy, an invisible price that only reveals itself when there is no longer so much haste, when the noise of the world subsides, and there is time to listen to one's own conscience. It was in this space, between one equal afternoon and another, that I began to feel something different. A nuisance that had no name, but that insisted on remaining. It wasn't a big event that brought me here. There was no tragedy, no screams, no dramatic breakdowns. It was something quieter, almost respectful, like everything else in my life. A slow realization that I was too whole on the outside and too empty on the inside, as if I had always lived outside of myself. I look back and see a man who followed rules he never wrote, that obeyed limits that no one else remembered to have imposed. Still, I respected them faithfully. I grew up, worked, started a family, fulfilled my obligations. I did everything that was expected of me. And even so, something has always been missing. Perhaps what was missing was resistance. Not the noisy, aggressive one that confronts everything and everyone, but the simple resistance of saying no when something hurts. To say this is not fair when something weighs. To say I want to when life demands choices. I never said. I always thought that would be selfish. Today, at 74, I begin to understand that not resisting did not make me better. It just made me invisible. And this realization was not accompanied by anger. It came with sadness. A meek, deep sadness, which accuses no one but myself, because I believed it. And this belief has been with me for far too long. This is not a story about blaming the past. It is a belated attempt to understand it. A way to finally give a name to the silence that defined me. Maybe I can't change everything I've been, but I can still tell. And counting now is my first form of resistance. The fact that you are here, listening to this now, already says a lot about your sensitivity. What follows isn't just a personal story. It's a truth that many people have spent their entire lives trying to swallow. If you believe these stories need to keep being told, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. I was born in a simple house, one of those where everything had its place and almost nothing could be questioned. I don't remember luxury, but I also don't remember excesses of affection. What existed was order. A silent, firm order, which did not need to be explained because everyone seemed to know exactly how to act. Since I was little, I understood that the best way to live there was not to attract attention. My father was a man of few words and quick decisions. When he spoke, no one interrupted. Not because he screamed, but because the whole room fit his tone. My mother was always tired, always busy, always trying to keep the house running without conflicts. She did not contradict it. He observed, agreed, moved on. And I learned by watching both. It was not a childhood marked by explicit violence or great tragedies. It was more subtle than that. It was the absence of space for questions. When I questioned something, The same answer always came, "It's not time, we'll talk later," or simply a look that ended the subject. Gradually, I stopped asking. I remember small situations, but they were recorded. Simple desires that I swallowed to avoid comments. Opinions that I held because I realized they caused discomfort. It was as if there was a permanent climate of alert, a constant care not to disorganize the fragile balance of the house. From an early age, I understood that causing problems was something serious, worse than making mistakes. Making mistakes still allowed correction. Causing trouble brought heaviness, silence, disappointment, and I didn't want to be responsible for that. So I molded myself. I was getting smaller on the inside, even growing on the outside. There was a constant feeling that I owed something, as if my existence needed to be compensated with good behavior. I don't remember anyone saying it directly, but it was something you felt, an invisible kind of debt that I tried to pay by being obedient, quiet, helpful. At school, this pattern continued. I wasn't the best student, but I never gave any trouble either. It didn't attract attention. He did not raise his hand. He would rather go unnoticed than run the risk of making mistakes in public. The teachers liked me precisely because of that. Another confirmation that silence was rewarded. At home, compliments came when I didn't complain, when he accepted, when I adapted. "He doesn't give work," they said, and that sounded like a prize. I didn't know it yet, but that compliment was teaching me something dangerous, that my worth was directly linked to my ability to endure in silence. Over time, I began to feel ashamed of my own desires, as if wanting something different was a defect. I started to observe others before acting, to measure reactions, to predict consequences, all to avoid the discomfort of others, even if it cost mine. I don't remember doing it consciously. It was happening. One adjustment here, another there, an unspoken word, a restrained gesture. When I realized, it was already part of me. I didn't bother because I had learned that bothering was wrong. Today, looking back, I see that that child was not weak. She was just trying to emotionally survive the environment she grew up in. But at the time, I didn't know that. I just knew that being quiet kept me safe. And this lesson, learned too soon, has been with me throughout my life. The rules of my childhood were never hung on the wall, nor were they explained out loud. They were in the air, in the gestures, in the pauses between one sentence and another. I learned to recognize them by what happened after someone broke them. A heavy atmosphere, interrupted conversations, doors closed with excessive care. That was enough to understand what should not be done. One of these rules was simple. Adults should not be contradicted. It didn't matter if they were wrong or not. Questioning was seen as disrespectful, and respect, in that house, meant agreeing. I grew up believing that my role was to accept what came from above, without trying to understand too much. Another important rule was not to show discomfort. If something made me sad, I should keep it. If it made me angry, even worse. Difficult emotions were not welcome. They messed up the order, created discomfort. So I learned to smile when it was expected, to stay neutral when I was confused, to swallow when something hurt. There were phrases that were repeated frequently, and that, without me realizing it, became part of my inner voice. It doesn't make a scene, it passes. There are people in a worse situation. They were said naturally, almost like advice, but each of them reinforced the idea that feeling too much was wrong. I watched the adults around me and saw how they all seemed to fulfill their roles without question. My father working, my mother resolving everything in silence, relatives avoiding conflicts. No one seemed happy, but everyone seemed correct. And I associated correction with value. If I were correct, I would be accepted. These rules also shaped how I saw myself. I came to believe that my perceptions were unreliable, that if something bothered me, the problem was probably with me. This created a silent confusion inside me. I felt it, but I doubted what I felt. Over time, I stopped sharing what was going on with me, not because no one asked, but because I didn't see the point in answering. I already knew which emotions were acceptable and which should be stored. It was easier to avoid than to explain. These invisible rules did not prevent me from living, but defined the limits of my existence. I could go so far as long as I didn't go beyond the comfort of others. There was always a line I wasn't supposed to cross, and I policed myself not to get close to her. As a teenager, when others began to impose themselves, I kept retreating. I saw colleagues face parents, teachers, the world. Some were injured, others grew. I just watched. I thought that wasn't for me. Resisting seemed too dangerous. Today I realize that these unwritten rules were more effective than any direct imposition, because I internalized them. I started to watch myself alone. I didn't need anyone to shut me up anymore. I did it on my own. They have accompanied me in adulthood, in relationships, at work, in all important choices. Whenever the urge to say no arose, the silent rule appeared first, and I would retreat, believing that I was doing the right thing. Only now, so many years later, can I see how much these rules limited me. They didn't protect me, they just taught me how to live inside a very small space. A safe space, yes, but also lonely and profoundly silent. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old when it happened. I don't remember the exact day, but I remember the feeling with uncomfortable clarity. It was one of those small, almost banal situations that no one else would remember. But for me, it became a landmark, a silent turning point, one of those that change everything without making noise. I wanted something simple, nothing grandiose, nothing impossible. I wanted to say that I didn't agree, that it didn't seem fair to me. I remember rehearsing the sentence from the inside before speaking, carefully, choosing words that didn't sound offensive. Even so, when I spoke, the environment changed. There were no screams. There was no physical punishment. There was something worse for a child like me, failure. An adult looked at me firmly and said in a dry tone that I was being selfish, that thinking that way was just thinking about me, that I needed to learn to accept things as they were. The word selfish fell on me like a weight. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I understood that it was something bad, something I shouldn't be, something that would take me away from the love, acceptance, peace of that house. And at that moment, resistance came to be associated with this. Someone added that complaining only created problems, that there were people making an effort, and I was there, questioning. The message was clear. My discomfort was inconvenient. My perception was an obstacle, and my attempt at resistance, a character flaw. I kept quiet immediately, not out of conscious obedience, but out of fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of being seen as someone difficult, fear of losing that little bit of emotional security I had. I swallowed what I felt and apologized, even without understanding exactly why. After that, no one returned to the subject. For adults, it was solved. For me, no. Something settled there. Constant internal surveillance. Whenever a desire arose, the question came right behind, is this selfishness? And almost always the answer was yes. From that day on, I began to anticipate conflicts before they even existed. I started to nip thoughts in the bud. If something bothered me, I would try to convince myself that it wasn't important. If I felt like disagreeing, I remembered the word that marked me, selfish. That was the moment when silence ceased to be just a choice and became a moral rule. Not resisting was not only easier when it was a certainty. Resisting has come to mean hurting others. And I didn't want to be that kind of person. The most curious thing is that no one ever had to repeat that accusation. It was engraved on me. It grew with me. He adapted to new situations, to new relationships. Whenever I thought about standing up, guilt came first. Today, looking back, I realized that that episode did not teach me empathy. It taught me fear. Fear of fully existing. Fear of taking up space. Fear of being seen as someone who thinks of themselves. It was there, in that seemingly small scene, that I began to confuse kindness with nullification. And this confusion has accompanied me for decades. Because when a child learns that resisting is selfishness, he grows up believing that disappearing is a virtue. Growing up without a voice is not something that happens suddenly. There is no specific day when we wake up mute inside. It is a slow, almost polite process. In my case, it was like that. As the years passed, I became better and better at not expressing what I thought, what I felt, what I wanted. And the better I got at it, the more praised I was. As a teenager, I began to realize that there was something different between me and others. My classmates argued with their parents, slammed doors, defended ideas. Some exaggerated, it is true, but there was life there. I watched from afar, trying to understand how they managed to do that without feeling guilty. To me, raising my voice seemed too big a risk. I even felt like reacting in some situations. Small injustices, comments that diminished me, decisions made without consulting me. But the reaction died before it was born. The same thought always came, it's not worth it. And actually, what I wanted to say was, it's not safe. I came to believe that my opinions were dispensable, that if no one asked, it was because they didn't matter. This made me develop a strange skill. I adapted quickly to any environment, as long as I didn't have to position myself. It was as if I molded myself to the expectations of others with too much ease. At school, I was the low-key student. In the temporary job I had later, it was the employee who accepted everything. Bad schedules, extra tasks, unfair decisions. There was always someone more willing to complain, and I hid behind it. I thought I was being mature. In fact, it was just repeating the pattern. Over time, I began to confuse peace with the absence of conflict. If no one was upset with me, I thought everything was fine, even when I wasn't, even when something bothered me deeply. External peace has become more important than any internal discomfort. This absence of voice also affected the way I saw myself. I no longer knew how to differentiate what I wanted from what I accepted. My choices were made by elimination, never by desire. I chose what caused the least friction, what seemed most appropriate, what was expected of me. There were times when I felt a kind of emptiness, but I couldn't explain it. It was not clear sadness, nor anger. It was a feeling of living life in a lateral way, as someone who observes more than participates. But I pushed those thoughts away quickly. Questioning too much has always seemed dangerous to me. When someone praised my calmness, I felt a mixture of pride and discomfort. Proud to be recognized. Discomfort because, deep down, that calm did not come from balance, but from restraint. I held much more than I showed, but no one saw that, and I didn't say it. Growing up without a voice means learning to constantly adjust, measuring words, gestures, expressions, to anticipate other people's reactions even before understanding their own. I did it for so long that it became automatic. It did not require conscious effort. It was who I was. Today I realize that, while I learned not to bother, I also learned not to exist entirely. My presence was functional, correct, acceptable, but something essential was missing. I was missing. And at that time, I still didn't have the words to understand that. I just kept going, believing that this was how life worked. When it came time to make important decisions, I was already too trained not to really choose. The options arose, of course, but I always moved towards the one that caused less friction, fewer questions, less discomfort for others. I told myself that I was being sensible, that he was being responsible. Today, I know that most of the time I was just avoiding conflict. The wedding was like that. There was no great passion that took me off track, nor a decision made with deep conviction. There was anticipation. There was gentle pressure. There was a sense that this was the natural next step. I accepted, not because it was exactly what I wanted, but because it felt like what was expected of me. And I never knew how to deal well with broken expectations. Within the relationship, I maintained the same pattern. I gave in. It adjusted. He swallowed small daily frustrations in the name of harmony. When something bothered me, I thought it wasn't serious enough to become a topic. There was always something more important, someone more tired, a reason to leave it for later. And the after almost never came. At work, I followed the same path. He didn't aim for much, but he didn't complain either. I accepted roles I didn't choose, schedules I didn't like, decisions that didn't make sense to me. When I saw colleagues taking a stand, I thought that it was not in my nature. I told myself that I preferred peace to recognition. Over time, I realized that my life seemed stable in the eyes of others. Everything in place. Family, job, routine. I myself said that everything was fine, and in many moments, it really seemed to be. But there was a lingering sense that I was living a scaled-down version of my own existence, as if I had accepted less than I could, without ever admitting it out loud. The choices I made were not wrong, but they were not whole either. Something was missing in them. There was a lack of desire. There was a lack of truth. I chose by exclusion, not by will. I chose the quietest path, not the most honest with myself. There were times when I felt like changing, to say no, to ask for something different. But the idea of causing discomfort always spoke louder. I convinced myself that it was too late, that it was not worth touching what was already built. And so he continued to accumulate small renunciations that, added together, weighed too much. I've also become accustomed to minimizing my own feelings. If something hurt, I said it would pass. If I was frustrated, I remembered that it could be worse. This internal speech kept me functional, but distant from myself. I survived well. He lived little. With the children, I repeated part of the pattern without realizing it. I wanted to be a calm, understanding father. I avoided conflicts, I avoided imposing, but I also avoided exposing myself. In many moments, I was more physically present than emotionally. I thought I was protecting everyone, including me. Today, I understand that these choices did not seem like choices because I never felt authorized to want anything different. I was following an invisible script, written long before I understood that I could question it. And as I followed, everything seemed normal. But normality is not synonymous with plenitude. It took me many years to realize that. Too many years. Because when we learn early not to resist, we end up believing that accepting is the only possible way, even when this path slowly takes us away from who we really are. For many years, I have heard the same words repeated about me, coming from different people, in different situations. He's so chill. Never complain. He's a good person. At first, these phrases warmed me up. It was as if they confirmed that I was doing everything right. Over time, they came to sound like a label I no longer knew how to escape. Being good for me has become synonymous with being silent. The less I said, the more approved I looked. The more I accepted, the more praised I was. And I clung to that, because approval has always been something too precious to be risked. I had learned early on that disagreeing could cost affection, respect, belonging. I avoided any attitude that could place me as someone difficult. If something bothered me, I solved it myself. If someone crossed the line, I convinced myself that it wasn't bad. There was always an explanation that did not require confrontation. There was always a way to swallow a little more. Deep down, I believed that this behavior made me better than others. More mature, more balanced. While some exploded, I remained steadfast. At least that's how I told the story to myself. It was easier to believe this than to admit that I was afraid. This fear was not conscious. It was not a panic, of course. It was something more subtle, a constant fear of disappointing, of being rejected, of losing the place I had earned as the man who doesn't cause problems. I protected this image with excessive care. Over time, I realized that people got used to it. They expected me to automatically agree, to adapt immediately. When something needed to be decided, I was rarely consulted. Not out of explicit disrespect, but because everyone already knew that I would accept. And I accepted. There were times when I felt like saying something different, expressing a limit, showing discomfort. But it was enough to imagine the discomfort that this could cause for me to give up. Silence always seemed the safest option, cleaner, more correct. Being good, in that context, meant being predictable. It meant not surprising anyone with strong opinions or desires of one's own. I became someone who was easy to fit into the lives of others, but difficult to recognize in my own. The problem is that, over the years, this role began to weigh heavily. I realized that I was always available, always understanding, always ready to give in, but rarely did anyone ask what I wanted. And when I asked, I no longer knew how to answer. I was afraid that if I started talking, I wouldn't know how to stop. Fear of discovering that there was a lot stored inside. So I remained silent, not for lack of thoughts, but for excess of them. Today, looking back, I see that being good never required me to disappear. But that's what I did. I confused kindness with annulment, calm with repression, maturity with silence. And for a long time, no one questioned that. Neither did I. Being silent brought me approval, but it also brought me distance. Distance from myself, mainly. And this is a difficult loss to measure because it does not happen all at once. It accumulates slowly, until the day we realize that we can hardly hear it inside anymore. Guilt was a constant companion in my life, although I didn't always know how to identify it as such. It did not come as a sudden burden, nor as a clear remorse. It was more like a permanent background, a low noise that never ceased. Even when everything seemed fine, there was this feeling that I owed someone something. I felt guilty about small things, for wanting to rest when there was something to do, for thinking about myself before others, even if only for a few seconds, because I feel irritation, tiredness, frustration, common human emotions, but which in me were always accompanied by shame. This guilt had no specific motive. I couldn't point out a concrete error, an obvious flaw. Still, she was there, as if I were always at fault, always owing an invisible explanation. And to compensate, I gave more. It helped more. It silenced more. In marriage, this manifested itself in a subtle way. I avoided exposing dissatisfaction because I felt I had no right. I thought that other people were dealing with bigger problems, that I shouldn't complain about. Even when something hurt me, I minimized it. I told myself that it wasn't that serious. With the children, the guilt appeared in another way. I wanted to be an example, someone correct, someone who didn't create conflicts. But at the same time, I felt that something was missing, as if I were present, but incomplete. This left me confused. And the confusion, once again, turned into guilt. At work, I took on responsibilities that weren't mine. I accepted mistakes that I didn't make. I thought that if something went wrong, I could probably have done more. This posture made me trustworthy in the eyes of others, but it wore me out inside. I carried weights that I didn't need to carry. Guilt also influenced my emotional health, although I never used that term at the time. I just felt tired, a tiredness that did not go away with rest, a silent exhaustion, without a name, without a clear explanation. And yet, I kept going. I didn't talk about it with anyone. Part of me thought it didn't make sense. Another part was afraid of appearing weak, ungrateful, exaggerated. After all, I had a life considered good. What did I have to complain about? This question silenced me before I even tried to answer. There were days when I woke up with a strange feeling, like I was late for something important, but I didn't know why. A diffuse discomfort, difficult to explain. I didn't know it. I wore my routine and followed. I always followed well. The problem is that the guilt doesn't go away when it's ignored. She settles down. It spreads to the corners of life, influencing decisions, shaping behaviors. In my case, it reinforced the idea that I needed to continue being good, quiet, correct. It was as if any deviation from it could reveal something wrong with me. Today I realize that this fault was never really mine. It has been learned, absorbed, cultivated over the years. But at that time, I didn't know that. I just knew that she never left me alone. And without understanding the origin, I kept trying to compensate. In silence. Always in silence. For a long time, I thought the silence I carried was only emotional. Something internal, invisible, that left no marks. But the body, unlike the mind, does not know how to fake forever. He starts talking when we spend too many years keeping quiet. And with me, it happened slowly, almost politely, like everything else in my life. It wasn't a specific pain that appeared suddenly. It was a constant tiredness, a feeling of heaviness that I couldn't explain. I slept, but woke up tired. I rested, but I didn't feel renewed. I told myself that it was age, that it was normal, and maybe it was, in part. But there was something more than that. I began to notice that my body reacted before me, a tightness in the chest when I needed to deal with certain situations, a tension in my shoulders whenever I swallowed something I wanted to say, a slight shortness of breath, almost imperceptible, in moments of decision. I ignored these signals with the same skill that I ignored so many emotions throughout my life. There were days when the simple act of leaving the house seemed to require more effort than it should. It wasn't laziness. It was wear and tear. A wear and tear accumulated by years of containment, constant adaptation, internal surveillance. I was tired of being correct all the time. Even so, I didn't talk about it. When someone asked how I was doing, the answer came automatically. All right, everything has always been fine. This phrase became a shield, a quick way to end any possibility of deeper conversation, and no one insisted. I began to reduce activities, avoid meetings, refuse invitations. He said it was a lack of energy, and it was true, but it wasn't just physics. There was an emotional fatigue that I couldn't name. Something inside me asked for a break, but I didn't know exactly what. At times, the body reacted more intensely, a sudden malaise, a feeling of pressure, a discomfort that forced me to stop. At those times, I felt afraid, not just what could be wrong physically, but what could arise if I were forced to stop and look within. I went to doctors, did tests, heard that everything was as expected. Nothing serious, nothing alarming. And that, in a way, frustrated me, because I felt that something was not right. But there was no name, no diagnosis, no clear explanation. Then I would return home with the same feeling as always, that I needed to hold on a little longer. The body kept talking, even so. In small, forced breaks, in sleepless nights, in an irritation that arose for no apparent reason. I was starting to lose patience with myself, but not with others. With them, I remained understanding. It was at this stage that I began to realize that silence had a physical cost, that swallowing it all wasn't just an emotional choice, but a constant effort that took its toll. My body was tired of sustaining a lifetime of restraint. Still, I resisted this idea. To acknowledge this would mean to admit that something was wrong with the way I lived, and that was too big a truth to face at that moment. So I followed, as I always did. Slower, perhaps, but still silent. But the body does not forget. He guards. And when he decides to speak, he does not ask permission. I didn't know it yet, but I was approaching a point where ignoring it would no longer be an option. Something began to move inside me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could shut up. The phrase came in a simple, almost careless way. It was not said with the intention of hurting, nor did it carry apparent weight. It was during an ordinary conversation, one of those that promised nothing more than to fill time. Still, she cut through me in a way that no direct accusation ever could. Someone said, looking at me matter-of-factly, "You never choose anything for yourself." There was no trial. There was no harsh tone, just observation. And maybe that's why it hurt so much, because it sounded too true to ignore. At the time, I smiled. I did what I always did. I deviated, minimized, partially agreed. He said something vague, as if it were not quite like that. But inside, something moved. A strange feeling, as if a crack had opened in a structure too old to be questioned. I spent the rest of the day with that phrase echoing in my head. She appeared in the breaks, in the silences, in the moments when I was alone. It was not accompanied by anger, but by a deep restlessness. I tried to push her away, but she came back, persistent, uncomfortable. I began to revisit old memories in a new light. Small situations that once seemed normal began to take on another meaning. Decisions accepted without reflection, paths followed by inertia, words swallowed to keep the peace. All of this began to organize itself in a different way within me. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my way of living had not been just the result of circumstances, that perhaps I had participated more actively in this silence than I liked to admit. This idea scared me, because it meant taking responsibility, and I have always associated responsibility with guilt. At the same time, there was a strange relief in this realization, as if something finally made sense, as if that old weariness, that constant guilt, that emptiness that is difficult to explain had a common origin. It was not weakness. It was a pattern, a learning that is too old. I spent nights thinking about it, reviewing conversations, decisions, relationships. In all of them, I appeared in the same way: adaptable, understanding, silent, always present, but rarely whole, always available, but barely visible. The phrase came back, "You never choose anything for yourself." It was not absolute truth. I had made choices, of course, but almost all of them were shaped by the fear of displeasing, of causing discomfort, of appearing selfish. I didn't choose out of desire. I chose as a precaution, and that changed the way I saw my own story. That was the beginning of the awakening, although I did not yet know how to call it that. There were no tears at that moment, no grand declarations. There was silence, a silence different from what I knew, a silence that did not repress, but observed. For the first time, I didn't try to silence the discomfort. The crack opened by that sentence did not close. On the contrary, it began to expand, slowly, revealing all that lay behind the wall I had built throughout my life. I still didn't know what to do with it. I just knew that something had changed, and that there was no longer any way to pretend that it wasn't. For a long time, I believed that my silence said something beautiful about me, that he revealed maturity, patience, generosity. That's how I explained it to myself. That was how others seemed to see. But after that sentence, something began to unravel inside, and what arose in its place was not anger. It was lucidity. I began to observe my own history more honestly than I had ever done. Situations that I used to call adaptation started to look like giving up. Attitudes that I defended as understanding began to sound like fear. And little by little, the word virtue lost the meaning that I had given it for so many years. I realized that I didn't stay silent because I was better than the others. I kept quiet because I learned that speaking was expensive. It cost acceptance, affection, tranquility, and I always thought I couldn't afford that price. Then I convinced myself that silence was a noble choice. It was easier than admitting that it was protection. This realization was painful. Not because someone had deceived me, but because I had collaborated with it. I had reinforced the pattern. I had repeated the same logic at different stages of life, with different people, in different contexts, and always with the same justification. It's better this way. I began to see how convenient my behavior had been for many. I facilitated decisions, avoided conflicts, absorbed tensions. My silence made the lives of others simpler, and that earned me praise, recognition, a sense of belonging. But this belonging had too high a price. The hardest thing was to accept that almost no one really knew me. People knew the adapted, careful, predictable version. They didn't know my limits, my desires, my disagreements, because I never showed them. And in a way, that was comfortable for everyone, except for me. This realization brought a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for everything I stopped living being who I was. Relief to finally understand why something has always seemed out of place. It was not ingratitude. It was not weakness. It was an internal conflict that was never resolved. For the first time, I began to wonder who I would have been if I had learned early on that resisting is not hurting, that disagreeing is not lack of love, that saying no does not destroy true bonds. These questions were not accompanied by clear answers, but they were already a step forward. Before, I didn't even dare to formulate them. That was the second great emotional peak in my story. There was no uncontrolled crying, no dramatic revelation. There was understanding. And understanding sometimes hurts more than any confrontation, because it doesn't allow any more escape. Once we see it, we can't unsee it. I realized that my silence was never a virtue. It was emotional survival. And surviving is not the same as living. This difference, so simple and so profound, hit me hard. I had survived very well, but now I wanted something different. It wasn't about blaming my parents, my family, the past. It was about recognizing the impact of it all on me, and to accept that, even late, I could still do something with that awareness. The question that then arose was inevitable. What would I do with this truth? What comes now is the hardest part to tell. Talking about it means letting go of the silence that protected me for decades and facing the weight of what was lost. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that some truths require courage to be said. Sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that voices like this are not swallowed up by silence again. As I began to look at my life more clearly, a nagging question arose. Who has really benefited from my silence all these years? At first, I tried to push that thought away. It seemed unfair, almost petty. But the more I reflected, the more I realized that he needed to be faced. My silence made things much easier. It facilitated decisions that didn't need to be explained. It facilitated choices made without consulting me. It facilitated relationships in which only one side adjusted. I was the shortest route, the simplest option. And this did not happen out of explicit malice. It happened because I allowed it. People got used to my absence of resistance. They did not expect questions. They did not prepare for disagreements. My whatever has become the rule. My constant adaptation became a guarantee. And little by little, my opinion was no longer necessary. In the family environment, this was clear. Important decisions were made, and I just followed. Sometimes they informed me later, sometimes not even that. There was no intention to exclude. There was just no expectation that I wanted anything different. And I never denied this expectation. At the wedding, I noticed the same pattern. My silence avoided discussions, but it also prevented real adjustments. I swallowed discomfort to maintain stability, not realizing that I was building a silent distance. I was present, but not whole. And it affected me more than I admitted. With her children, the situation was even more delicate. I wanted to be understanding, accessible, calm, but I often confused this with absence. I avoided imposing limits, but I also avoided exposing myself. My silence, which I found protective, sometimes sounded like indifference. This realization hurt more than any other. At work and in social relationships, the pattern was repeated. I took on extra tasks, absorbed tensions, solved problems without complaining. That made me useful, reliable, but also invisible. When I wasn't, they missed what I did, not who I was. This realization was not accompanied by anger. It came with a serene sadness, because I realized that there were no clear villains in this story. There was a silent system of expectations and concessions, of which I was always an active part. My silence fed this system. I also had to recognize something difficult. Not everyone wanted me to change. For some, my late resistance was uncomfortable. They preferred the old, predictable, easy version, and that said more about the dynamics of relationships than it did about me. At the same time, I began to notice small, different reactions. People who were surprised when I said what I thought. Others that seemed confused, as if I was breaking an invisible agreement, and maybe he was. An agreement that I never remembered signing. Understanding who benefited from my silence wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about seeing reality without filters. My silence had effects. It made life easier for many while making mine difficult. Recognizing this was liberating and painful at the same time. Because, by seeing clearly, I also understood that remaining silent would be a conscious choice. And that was a choice I no longer wanted to make, even if it meant disappointing, even if it meant losing some emotional amenities. For the first time, I was willing to pay the price of existing. To choose for me has always been a strange verb. I recognize the word, but not the practice. Throughout my life, I have become accustomed to accepting paths already traced, decisions already made, expectations already defined. So when I realized that maybe there was still room for real choice, the feeling was less liberating than scary. The first time I really chose it wasn't something great. It did not involve dramatic ruptures or long speeches. It was something simple, almost invisible to outsiders. But inside, it had the weight of a quiet revolution. For the first time, I said no without apologizing afterwards. I remember the moment clearly. Someone expected the usual agreement from me, the same automatic gesture, the same predictable response. I felt the urge to give in, as I had done all my life. The body reacted, the heart accelerated, the old guilt tried to impose itself. But this time I waited. I took a deep breath and said that this was not what I wanted. I didn't explain too much. I did not justify myself excessively. I just said it. The sentence came out shaky, but it came out in one piece. And when it ended, the silence that formed was different from all the others I have experienced. There was strangeness, confused looks, a discomfort in the air that I knew well. For years, this discomfort would have been enough to make me retreat. But something in me had changed. For the first time, I didn't run to fill the silence. I endured. Then came the guilt, as expected. That old feeling that I had done something wrong, that I had hurt someone, that I had been selfish. But along with it came something new, a discreet, almost shy but real relief. I had heard myself. That small choice opened an inner door that I didn't know existed. Not because it solved everything, but because it showed that it was possible, that I could survive the discomfort, that the world didn't collapse when I put myself first, even if only for an instant. In the following days, I kept an eye on my reactions. I realized how much I was used to watching myself, correcting myself, diminishing myself. Choosing required attention, presence, courage. It wasn't automatic. It was a new exercise, and therefore tiring. But he was also alive. Some people reacted badly. Others pretended not to notice. There were those who respected it. Each reaction revealed something about the relationship we had. And interestingly, it brought me more clarity than any long conversation would have done. I didn't become someone else overnight. I didn't resist everything or say no all the time. But something fundamental had changed. I knew I could. And this knowledge by itself already changed everything. Choosing, I realized, is not an isolated act. It is an internal position. It is assuming that my desires have value, even if they do not please, even if they cause discomfort, even if they arrive late. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of it. Gradually, I understood that that simple choice was not about winning something external. It was about recovering something internal, a part of me that had been forgotten for decades. And at that moment, I knew, even late, there was still time to exist in a more whole way. After the first choice came what I had always feared, the consequences. They were not explosions, nor direct confrontations. These were subtle changes, almost imperceptible to those who were not attentive. A distance here, a different silence there, an invitation that stopped happening. Small things that, together, formed a new scenario. Some people seemed uncomfortable with my new posture. They didn't know exactly what to do with it. I had stopped being predictable. And predictability, I've learned, is something that many value more than the truth. My silence has always worked as an emotional buffer. Without him, relations needed to readjust. There were times when I wondered if I had done the right thing, especially when loneliness became more evident. There was a new emptiness, different from the one that had accompanied me all my life. Before, emptiness came from not existing. Now, it came to exist and not always be welcomed. That was the hardest price to accept. Understand that not everyone wants to live with someone who starts to take a stand too late. To some, my move seemed like a timing error, as if there was a deadline to have a voice, as if after a certain age, silence was the only acceptable option. At the same time, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: coherence. What I thought and what I did began to align, albeit unsteadily. That brought discomfort, yes, but it also brought a strange sense of dignity. I finally recognized myself in my own gestures. Not all losses were real. Some were just old fears manifesting. I found that certain relationships held up better than I had imagined. That some people, even if they were surprised, respected. And that there were those who approached me precisely because I was more whole. The price of existing also included dealing with regrets. To think about how many times I could have spoken, chosen, resisted. These thoughts came, but I learned not to drown in them. The past did not change. The present, yes. And it was on him that I needed to focus. There were days when I felt like going back, to take back the old role, more comfortable, more accepted. After all, I had been very good at it. But something in me no longer allowed that. Once we experience truly existing, even if only a little, it is difficult to accept complete erasure. I learned that existing is not a costless act. It never was. What changes is who pays this cost. For decades, I was the one who paid alone, in silence. Now the cost was shared. Sometimes it fell on others. And that still caused me discomfort. But I was learning to endure it. This chapter of my life was not marked by great external victories. There was no recognition, no applause. There was something more discreet and, for me, more valuable: honesty. I started to live in a way that made sense on the inside, even when it complicated on the outside. The price of existing is high for those who have spent their entire lives hiding, but I discovered that the price of not existing is even greater. He charges little by little in the form of emptiness, guilt, and tiredness. And that was a cost that I was no longer willing to continue paying. Today, when I look at everything I have experienced, I do not feel angry. This is perhaps the most surprising part. For a long time, I thought that if one day I understood what happened to me, revolt would come. But what came was something calmer. A lucid acceptance, without illusions, but also without hatred. I understand now that I did the best I could with what I learned. I learned too early that resisting was dangerous, that disagreeing drove away, that silence protected, And those lessons helped me survive emotionally in an environment where I didn't know how to defend myself otherwise. This does not erase the consequences, but explains the path. Still, understanding does not mean justifying everything. There were real losses. Moments when I could have been more truthful, more present, more whole. People who never knew who I really was. Dreams that never came into existence because I silenced them even before formulating them. These absences are part of my history. It took me many years to understand that resisting is not an attack, that saying no is not abandonment, that taking a stand does not destroy true bonds. It only reveals which bonds are sustained in the absence of a voice. That simple truth changed everything for me, even though it came so late. Today, at 74, I'm not trying to make up for lost time. That would be impossible and unfair to myself. What I do now is something more honest. I allow myself to exist in the time I have left, with limits, with choices, with silence only when it is really mine. I learned that the guilt that accompanied me for decades was not a sign of moral failure, but of conditioning. I have been trained to confuse love with obedience, peace with nullification, kindness with disappearance. Naming it was painful, but also liberating. If anyone is listening to this story right now and recognizes themselves in it, I want to say something important. You are not weak for keeping quiet. Often, silence is the only form of survival we learn. But surviving doesn't have to be the end point. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told, and even when they arrive late, they still matter. Maybe you still have time. Maybe it's not easy. But existing, even if gradually, is always worth it. If anything in this story touched you, please share this video. It's not just about what I've experienced, but about a silent pattern that crosses families, generations, and cultures. By sharing, you can get that message across to someone who still believes that being silent is a virtue, and help break a cycle that only continues because no one speaks. I'm going to stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me, what city or country you're watching from, and what part of that story stuck with you. Reading that matters more to me than you think.